You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. The Five of Cups and I had a moment recently, and we're going to talk about all the thoughts that poured out of me when I pulled this card a few days ago. This might sound morbid, but I've spent a great deal of my life thinking about and preparing for grief. So whenever I pull the Five of Cups, it kind of feels like a familiar friend. It doesn't overwhelm me or really even bring much up for me, usually. But this time was different. I pulled this card and I don't know, I was suddenly just kind of like flooded with the physical sensations of grief. And it wasn't the type of grief that felt inconsolable or that I needed to regulate or tend to. It was almost like kind of information overload. And I just felt like I had access to so many memories all of a sudden and thoughts and ideas, especially about the concept of grief. And I don't know, one day maybe I'll sit down and organize all these thoughts that I had, but for now, they are showing up messy and a little chaotic on this podcast in the form of this episode for all of you to bear witness to. My first experience with death and grief was the passing of my Uncle Barry. I was like 9, and I had watched him slowly deteriorate over a few years until he finally succumbed to brain cancer. And I remember that day so vividly. I remember my mother rushing out the door because my uncle was next door to my aunt. My family lived right next door to each other. And, my father was already there by his brother's side, and they had moved a hospital bed in the living room of my grandmother's home where he was living. And I specifically remember above his hospital bed in the living room, there was a big clock on the wall. And I remember once they had come and picked him up and removed his body, I looked up at the clock and it had stopped working. And later I would learn, my grandmother would tell me the clock stopped at exactly the time that he had passed. And then over the next couple days, the clock on my nightstand next to my bed stopped working, but would also randomly ring its alarm at odd hours of the night over the following days. And during that time, I also had the most magical, vivid dreams of my uncle walking through fields of like just colorful wildflowers. And I was 9 years old and I can still see this dream in my mind. And he is just walking through this stunning wildflower field and just has the biggest smile on his face. And he's just got this glow of light around him. It's wild that, decades, many decades later, I can still see this dream. And so, in this way, I feel lucky that, my first experience with death and grief kind of came with these silly quirks like clocks not working anymore and really beautiful, happy dreams of wildflowers and smiling faces because, most people are not that lucky. As time would go on, I would eventually lose more family members, most of them way too soon. The majority of my aunts and uncles are gone now. My dad was one of 10. I think about them all often. In fact, I was just sharing old photos of my Uncle Tony, who, fun fact, is the father of this podcast's audio engineer. And, I think about him all the time. And I was sharing some memories with my partner recently, telling them all about my uncle's past and his love of music and how he would have thought their vinyl collection was just the coolest thing ever. And, it's interesting because those of you who have experienced grief and loss, you understand how important certain anniversaries or months are. So, and July 30th is my TT's birthday. And she, I think, is my greatest loss. And her photo sits on my desk next to my computer. But, I say she was probably my greatest loss because I think she caused the deepest personal grief that I've experienced. She was my sister's and I's protector. She was at our house every single day from the time I was 4 until I moved away, and thinking about all of this, I can notice that familiar ping of pain, it kind of like starts in the pit of your stomach and works its way up your chest and into your throat. That kind of like well of sadness, the heavy weight of really what is love that has nowhere to go. And, you have no choice but to hopefully let it kind of spill over in the form of memories shared with others. And then, as a teenager, I unfortunately lost a lot of friends to car accidents and honestly, mostly suicide. I've lost way too many friends to suicide. And, while I've been surrounded by death and loss, it's never been something I was afraid of. In fact, most people get freaked out when they walk into my home because, okay, so my partner calls my style vampire chic, which I feel like is so spot on and explains a lot. But yeah, there's a lot of death inspired decor everywhere. There's a lot of representations of death. And, we could probably psychoanalyze that and say maybe it's my way of getting closer to the one thing that I have no control over. But yeah, I digress. That's a whole other episode. But yeah, I've always been more afraid of not living enough, not seeing enough, not loving enough, not accomplishing enough, not learning enough. And my early experiences with death and grief, I feel like really primed me for now what feels like this kind of relentless curiosity about the concept of loss and grief in all of its forms. Because I feel like when we think about grief, we only think about it in a singular way. And that's the way I've been talking about it, the loss of someone that we love and care about. But that is not the only way that we experience grief. In fact, we grieve all the time. We grieve the life we don't live anymore. We grieve the friendships that have dissolved. We grieve the dreams we weren't able to bring to reality. We grieve the connection we can't seem to make with our partner as we simultaneously scroll on our phones at night, across the couch from each other or in bed. We grieve the people that we will one day lose but haven't yet. We grieve wishes that won't come true. We grieve hopes and ideas and energy. We also grieve versions of ourselves, the versions that we've outgrown or that we've had to abandon, or even the versions of ourselves that we want to hold space for, but feel like it's not safe enough to. We grieve the versions that were never able to exist at all. And even like the younger versions of ourselves who were maybe naive or still believed that everything would turn out okay when maybe eventually it didn't actually turn out okay. We grieve the version of us who maybe hadn't been jaded by disappointment or betrayal or the weight of continued and accumulated letdowns. And sometimes I think we underestimate how much it really hurts to realize that we're never going to be able to be those versions of ourselves before something happened or before we realized the dream wasn't going to become a reality. And that's a really unique, special type of grief. the grief for the life that never happened, the road we didn't take, the child we didn't have, the love we lost, the career we didn't chase, the version of reality that we thought we were going to be able to obtain, but, we couldn't. And I think we carry those versions or lives lost in our bodies like ghosts. And sometimes they emerge unexpectedly and they step outside of the carefully curated containers that we've created for them. And that's when confrontation with our grief is unavoidable. And so then we're faced with, okay, what are we supposed to do with this floating, translucent, now decontained grief? And I think that's where tarot comes in. And I promise I'm going to pull cards in a minute. We will definitely get to tarot. And in fact, a lot of what I've learned about grief, my own grief, the grief of others, the grief of the world, of societies, of collective grief, cultural grief, has all been through curiosity, through experience, through therapy, through tarot, and really both sitting quietly with people and holding space for them, and also just witnessing grief from afar and naming it and being calm and compassionate towards it. Because the reality is grief does not want to be and cannot be fixed. It cannot be tidied up and, wrapped in a box with a neat little bow. But it does need to be honored. It does need to be named. And it really does need to be witnessed. And it needs to be witnessed by someone or, multiple people who are not going to try to just rush you out of that space or try to get rid of it. A lot of times that's, because so many of us are uncomfortable with this feeling and the sensation, both within ourselves and other people, that we just want, to quickly heal it, quickly fix it, get over it. But grief never goes away. There is no getting over it. There is no healing it. There is no fixing it. And a lot of people kind of scrunch their face at me when I say that. But the best way I know how to describe grief and the way it exists within us for eternity is a visual representation. And I, for the life of me, cannot remember who taught me this. I want to say it was probably my very first supervisor. I feel like she probably would have been someone who did this. But basically, what I do is I draw a circle, on a piece of paper, and the circle represents us. It represents our life. And I then just mark, and it's a pretty decent size circle, but I just mark up the whole circle with all these squiggly lines, and it just looks messy, really chaotic scribbles all over. And the scribbles fill the entire circle. And I tell folks, okay, this is you and your grief. This is a representation of your life right now and the grief that you're experiencing. And this is I should preface this by saying this is when I'm talking about kind of singular grief, not complicated grief. And this is usually kind of when something immediately happens. So it's the aftermath. And, grief in and of itself is very nuanced and complicated. And yeah, so take what I'm saying as just an example, not kind of an official way to talk about this. And so anyway, there's a circle. It's entirely kind of colored in with scribbles. And I say, this is your life and this is the representation of your grief. And then what I do is I draw next to it a larger circle and I scribble in that circle. And the scribble is the same exact size as the scribble in the original drawing. And so then we start talking about the differences between these two. And I'll say, okay, what do you notice about the two circles? And, the person will say, okay, well, the circle in the first drawing is smaller than the circle in the second drawing, but the scribbles are the same size. It's yes, because right now that circle represents the size of your life. And right now your grief is completely taking up that entire circle because that's the size of your life and your grief is so large. Over time, your grief does not get small. It does not shrink. It does not heal. It does not go away. Your grief stays the same Pretty much. It obviously expands and contracts, like, because it's a moving, kind of functional experience. But for the most part, it stays relatively around that same size. But your life expands and your life gets bigger. And so it gives this illusion that the grief is not taking up as much space because your life is getting bigger. And then we move into a conversation about what grief actually looks like and feels like, because it's kind of like a homesickness in a way. And it's homesickness for a place or a person, a feeling, a desire, or most often kind of a moment in time, especially when we're not specifically talking about the grief of losing someone we loved. And, again, we live in this culture that's so uncomfortable with grief. But the reality is, when we think about it, we think about grief as like someone kind of sobbing uncontrollably on the floor. But that's not the majority of the grieving experience. It's honestly a sense of disorientation. It's restlessness. It's getting angry. It's projecting. It's feeling heavy and not being able to explain why. And if we don't give ourselves permission to look at this circle with this chaotic scribble in the center and name what that is, then what's interesting is we risk cutting ourselves off from and denying the tenderness and the love and the capability and the potential and the possibility that we were once able to experience. And I think what makes this whole concept of grief and the feeling of grief difficult and complicated is we don't really know how to talk about it. We share eulogies and cliche platitudes, and that's pretty much it. And that lasts a couple weeks and then it goes away. And so our ability to find the language and the comfort in talking about it and holding space for and witnessing not just our own grief, but the grief of others is really what I think needs to happen collectively in order for us to feel more comfortable with it. So I am about to pull some cards, but one thing that I want to share is when I pulled the 5 of Cups a few days ago, that, inspired this kind of like overflow of emotion and memories and thoughts, was this word proof just kept kind of like reverberating in my mind. And I was like, oh, grief is proof. Grief is proof of the existence of what, is intangible, proof of love, proof of hope, proof of dreams. I mean, it's proof of life when the person or idea that we're grieving is long gone. And yeah, grief proves it was all real at some point. So now I want to take some time to pull some cards about how can we explore and tend to this, lifelong, inescapable experience of grief. And before I do that, I was thinking about and reading up on folks who are researching grief, and because I feel like it's been a little while since I've done that, and I came across the work of Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor, and I really admire her teaching grief as a form of learning, because that was the phrase or the word that I was feeling about grief, but could not figure out how to explain it. And so looking at it as a form of learning was really eye-opening for me, because, when we think about learning, we're expanding our minds, our brains, our bodies, our identities, the way we view the world, the way we view ourselves. And there's so much kind of neuro rewiring happening during the learning process. And we also have to learn how to exist again or live again, especially in the absence of what was. And that's often so difficult because we have this view in our mind of how our life is going to be with this person in it, or with this idea, or with this decision. And we moved in tandem with that. But how do we tend to this knowing that that no longer exists? So now we're finally pulling some cards. And if you've stuck with me this long, thank you. Thank you for hanging out with me while I don't know, hopefully this episode even makes sense to you all because I felt like this was I'm going to be honest, I was nervous about this episode because it was kind of like I was just like going to let myself ramble, and I usually take some notes when I do these episodes. And, I have like my bullet point list of things that I want to talk about. But this was very free flowy. And honestly, I did a lot of free association. And I was like, whatever comes up, I'm just going to let come up. And as someone who can be quite type A, that was that was quite the exercise for me. Okay, we have a card that flipped. Oh, of course this card would come out. The Ten of Swords. Okay. Well, I'm just gonna talk about this card, and then I think I'm gonna pull a series of cards. So the Ten of Swords. Oh my gosh. Well, if that's not the epitome of grief and pain and what we endure when we're experiencing grief, then I don't know what is. I think a way to view this card in terms of tending to the grief might be as, I'm thinking about the word surrender. I think a lot of times we try to push back. We want to, again, like I've used that word contain, we want to wrap grief up in a nice little bow and put it away and just kind of carry on. And that's not usually the best way to move forward. A lot of times we do have to kind of surrender into the pain and acknowledge that this person or this idea no longer exists. And we have to sit with that. Those of you who are familiar with trauma and psychosomatic therapy and even like autoimmune stuff, for example, a lot of that can be trauma and grief and pain gets trapped in the body and then leads to the physical manifestation of problematic stuff way later on in life. And I think the Ten of Swords kind of speaks to both sides of that, the needing to surrender and feel the pain in the moment, and also what happens if you don't allow yourself to experience and surrender into that. And because this is a swords, I think it could also represent kind of the cognitive overwhelm of grief and the trauma response of not really knowing how to get up and move and experience the next moment because everything feels impossible, like we can't move, we're paralyzed. So I think this is a great representation of just kind of grief in and of itself, maybe even beyond the traditional Five of Cups card that we view as the grief card. Okay, I'm going to pull a couple more cards and see if it kind of gives us a narrative for tending to, exploring, holding space for witnessing our grief. All right, so I'm going to do 3. All right, well, we have the 6 of Cups, another 10, the 10 of Wands, and then the Queen of Cups. Interesting. Okay, so the 6 of Cups, I want to start there. I mean, oh my God, if this doesn't talk about or depict kind of, the younger versions of ourselves, our past selves that we are grieving, I don't really know what does. But we're talking about this in terms of tending to. So, the 6 of Cups, it's such a nostalgia card. And I think we could look at this as, okay, when we're experiencing this grief, how can we orient ourselves in a way where we still feel like something matters, even though it's gone? And I know that can feel like complicated and like maybe we're hanging on to something that we need to let go of. But, when we allow ourselves to remember or to recall, not just, happy memories, but also complicated or frustrating, difficult memories, hard relationships, we are giving ourselves permission to honor and tend to our whole self. And without doing that, with trying to maybe forget, we can become really fragmented. And I think the 6 of Cups gives us permission to both remember and share, because we have two people here and there's a kind of some sort of exchange happening. And this is not to say we have to stay stuck in the past. I think it's more of a nod to remain or even cultivate really a relationship with our grief through the experience of remembering and sharing. And this could look so, different. I'm thinking about my Titi, whose birthday is coming up soon. And once July hit and I knew it was her birthday month, I've been thinking since July 1st, how do I want to honor her? And, oh my gosh, it's funny. So one of my favorite memories of her, and you're kind of getting a real, as I'm sharing this, these kind of like intimate, vulnerable parts of myself, you're getting to hear me kind of process and experience in real time what these archetypes are saying. So I'm talking about the Six of Cups as, going back and remembering and thinking and retelling and sharing. And so one of my favorite memories of my TT was when I was little, I'm talking like, 4, 5, 6, she would always let me do things my parents wouldn't let me do. And so I would climb up on the countertops in the kitchen. I have such a vivid memory of this. I'm probably 5. I'm climbing up on top of the countertops and I think I shared this memory in this story at her celebration of life. And I'm going through the back of the cabinets at stuff that I know we don't use because, I grew up, my parents didn't have money for, very, very long time. And so I knew I should not be using the food that they were going to cook with. And that was still edible because I would get in trouble. And so I was going back into like the very like dark depths of the forgotten corners of the cabinets and grabbing boxes of, I don't know, God only knows what. And I would make these concoctions, I'd grab a mixing bowl, there'd be like, there'd be overripe bananas with like, I don't know, taco seasoning that was like expired for a year, just like weird stuff. And I would just have so much fun kind of mixing things and feeling creative. And then I would present this bowl to her. And this is really showing you the power of archetypes right now in the imagery and tarot, because I see the Six of Cups and I'm immediately remembering, this exchange with my aunt, handing her this bowl of the most disgusting, vile concoction of fruit and taco seasoning and probably cereal. And her just digging in and taking a big bite and being so happy to share that moment with me. And, I knew my parents would have looked at me like I was crazy and said, throw that shit away. And she was just so excited to play with me and be silly. And oh my God, the stuff I must have put her through. And the Six of Cups really shows that. And even now, as I'm talking about this, thinking about death and loss and grief, this is such a both and experience because I am so fucking sad that this woman is not here with me right now, because there is so much that I want to tell her and so much that I want to hear from her. And yet here I am sharing this hilarious memory that just fills me with so much silliness and joy and love. And I'm getting to share it with all of you who are now getting to hear about my amazing Aunt Titi. And I think the Six of Cups really shows how important it is to remain in relationship with our grief, and that it doesn't always have to be the heavy parts of our grief. It can be through the sharing of the stories that I just did. It could be playing a song, listening to a song. It could be just like spending a moment sitting with it and thinking about this person and allowing yourself to step in and out of those moments. And I think that's really important. And that can be difficult. And I want to be gentle here too, because sometimes when we step into that space, if we are not well resourced or, we're not able to regulate enough, it can be difficult to step out of that. Which, oh my God, actually, I also pulled a 10 of Wands. So I feel like that 10 of Wands is that heaviness or the difficulty stepping out of it that I was just talking about. And I think it's important. This 10 of Wands is probably saying, hey, like we need to look at how you're interacting with this grief. Are you having these Six of Cups moments, or are you carrying it all by yourself and not sharing? Because when you're not sharing, oh my gosh, that's when you are just feeling so burdened and burnt out and you're exhausted and you've been carrying something for so long that you can't even see anything that's happening around you. And this is what we really want to avoid. We don't want this grief that is so heavy and it builds over time and becomes so accumulated that now we're barely functional because, we've got these 10 heavy wands that we can't set down. So yeah, I think this 10 of Wands really speaks to what happens when we don't allow others to witness our grief and when we don't fully hold space for our grief. It's kind of the consequence of trying to just move forward without honoring. And then we have the Queen of Cups, which that's funny. It's like, okay, yeah, go to therapy. But no, I'm joking. The Queen of Cups is, I think, really sweet to have here. I think she's the representation of our ability to coexist with our grief and, having this kind of like balance between, existing with it and also knowing that, hey, I can't exist with it 24/7. Like sometimes it does have to be, put away for a little bit. But the Queen of Cups here is really sweet because I think this is an archetype that reminds us that, we can hold our grief and look at it and be curious about it. And I think that there's a ritualistic aspect here. I love that, the Queen is kind of, holding this really fancy chalice, which I don't know, makes me think about the idea of doing some sort of ritual, which, a lot of times, we engage in indirectly kind of like without realizing it. And that's kind of really helpful and special for our grief. But another component here is, with this being a Cups card, I think that this speaks to the idea of feeling our grief, but not being overwhelmed by it. And knowing that this water is going to be super choppy sometimes. But, she almost kind of looks like she's on a little island too. So there's this idea of like, hey, you can kind of come and go as you need to. It actually feels really expansive and free when you look at this card. And actually, now that I'm saying the word expansive, I think that's probably the best word that describes the feeling of grief as well as how to tend to it. Because, yeah, oh my gosh, actually, earlier I mentioned when I'm talking about grief especially with clients and I draw those pictures, I talk about how our grief kind of expands and contracts, but also our life just continues to expand and get bigger. And the grief doesn't get smaller. It, maybe it stays relatively the same size, but as our life expands, it gives us more room to move around the grief. And I feel like this Queen of Cups is kind of a nod to that kind of gradual expansion that we feel that gives us the ability to move a little bit more freely around the grief instead of feeling trapped within it. I kind of want to pull one more card before I wrap up this episode, because now that I'm sitting with that word expansion, I just kind of want to see what Tarot has to say about it. Oh, the Ace of Cups, another cup for expansion. Oh, and it's the Ace of Cups. It's literally overflowing. Oh my God, that's perfect. Okay, so yeah, the Ace of Cups is obviously the expansion card. That's hilarious. Oh my gosh, I love when that happens. I think that, So to look at this Ace of Cups, this is really about allowing ourselves to experience kind of that spillover that so many of us are afraid of, but it's not necessarily a spillover of the overwhelming emotion that we feel with grief. And in fact, when I was sharing my story about my aunt just a few minutes ago in the Six of Cups, I had a moment. That was a very Ace of Cups moment now that I'm thinking about it. That was a very kind of like, I'm allowing this joy and this sorrow and this love and this loss to spill over into this episode, onto this podcast right now. And what's so interesting, and hopefully you all didn't experience this, but I experienced it internally. In my head, I was going, stop talking about this. They don't care. They don't want to hear about this. This is awkward. And there was like that part of me that was like, no, you shouldn't be doing this. You should be locking this away. But I pushed through that because I know deep down that that is the best way to tend to your grief is to let it spill out, to let people hold space for you. And I think this Ace of Cups is such a beautiful representation of that. Naturally, our reaction to grief is that, it tightens us. It tightens the body. It closes us off, and rightfully so. It's a form of protection. But I think the Ace of Cups is saying, hey, you can soften into this and you can be open. And this concept of expansion might only look like, one of these tiny drops in this Ace of Cups at first. But even one single drop is evidence that something is flowing and that energy is moving. And that is the proof that I was talking about earlier. Proof that what led to our grief did once exist. And even though it's not physically here anymore, or that idea can no longer come to fruition, or that version of ourself will no longer exist, that tiny drop shows and proves that it did exist at one point. And sometimes that's just all we need. Thank you so much for listening to the Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow the Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails, where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.